Do you ever find God really confusing? I mean, it's God, right? God wasn't confusing. I always think he wouldn't be God, because God is different from us. Yes, we're made in God's image, and yes, God reveals himself to us, but sometimes when God reveals himself to us, it gets even more confusing. I mean, for instance, it's not Trinity Sunday, but we all remember every Trinity Sunday, right? We all walk away with a little bit confused because we try to wrap our heads around the Trinity and it just doesn't work. We just can't understand how God is three, but one, but also one, but also three, but he's not three, he's one, but he's not one, he's three. It just gives us a little bit of a headache because God can be confusing. Luckily for us, though, we're in pretty good company because people throughout history have been trying to understand God and been just come away confused. I take great comfort in knowing that Jesus' disciples, the people who spent a good deal of time right there with Jesus, also got confused. And they got confused a lot, especially when Jesus would teach them using parables. These stories that he would tell that sometimes make perfect sense and sometimes leave you going, wait, what? Of course, it's a little tough for us too because Jesus' favorite way of teaching people is parables. And especially the ones that get me are the plant parables, because I don't plant. I understand that my grass grows, and I hate it. I hate that my grass grows. I want to replace all of my grass with AstroTurf so I never have to deal with plants. I don't do plant metaphors. And Jesus uses them all the time. Like today, when he's talking about a farmer sowing seed and it grows and does stuff. I have a hard time with these parables because, again, I don't plant. But luckily for us, the disciples were just as confused, and they asked Jesus for an explanation. And he gives them the explanation, which we've all heard 100 times. And then he says, "The secret of God's kingdom has been given to you, but to those who are outside, everything comes in parables. This is so that they can look and see and have no insight, and they can hear and not understand. Otherwise, they might turn their lives around and be forgiven." Well, that's a little odd. Jesus tells parables so that if it makes sense to you, it makes sense, but so that if it doesn't make sense to you, it doesn't make sense. What? Now, it doesn't hurt that he's quoting Isaiah here. So this is something that Jesus is quoting. The people who would hear it would go, oh, yeah, that's in Isaiah. We don't usually do that as much, but that's what they would have done. And I think what is being said here is, well, it all depends. It all depends on who is it that is getting in the way of these people hearing the message. Are they getting in the way, or is God getting in the way? Because if God's getting in the way, then it really doesn't fit with everything else that we know about God. Because God wants everyone to know who he is, so it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for God to confuse people as he's trying to show people who he is. So I take it the other way. That when people hear the parables, if they are wanting to get to know God, it'll make sense to them. But if they hear the parable and they don't want to get to know God, then they don't let it make sense to them. If God is the one who keeps people from understanding, then that goes against the overwhelming message of Scripture. But if the people themselves keep themselves from understanding, then they're just confusing themselves. So when Jesus says this, I think what he's trying to say is for those who live by faith, the parables talk about God's kingdom. But if you don't live by faith, the parables don't have any meaning. They hear them, but they don't really understand them. Because if they did understand them, they would turn their lives around and be forgiven. It's kind of that whole thing. If you turn your lives around and be forgiven, it all makes sense, but if it doesn't make sense, it's confusing. Like so many things of God, it's confusing. But these parables that Jesus tells, they do start to make sense when you start to look at them, right? I mean, the parable of the sower that we've heard so many times. The seed is the word. Some people it's stolen away immediately. Other people it grows, but there's no root. Other people it gets choked out by weeds. Other people it grows and it blossoms and it multiplies. The parable of the mustard seed is about the tiniest bit of faith becomes a big amount of faith. And the parable of the lampstand is if you're going to have a little bit of faith, you don't hide it under a bed, you're going to show it to everybody. They're real straightforward. But if you don't want to understand them, they're just weird stories. But then that brings up, where does faith come from? How does faith grow? And I think that's where the one parable from today's gospel that I haven't mentioned yet comes into play. About the farmer who plants seeds and then he goes to sleep. And while he's sleeping, the plants grow. Because God is the one who grows our faith. I mean, again, I'm really bad at plant metaphors, but I know that if you take a seed and you put it in the ground, it will grow. I don't know how it grows. I could read a book and find out all the details, but it still doesn't make sense. A little seed can't turn into a plant. That's not how life works. That's how my brain is anyways. But we all know if you take a seed and you put it in the ground and you water it, it will grow and you will get a plant. And you could do things to make that easier. You could do things to make that harder, but that's the idea. But nothing that I do to the seed is going to actually make that seed turn into a plant. And I can't believe I wrote this. I just want to put that out there. With my difficulty with plant metaphors, I cannot believe that I'm actually going to start to say the words that I'm about to say. Because we have a plant at our house. Actually, we have several plants, but there's this one in particular. I can't remember what it's called. It's a weird name that starts with an S and ends with a blah, blah, blah. I don't know what it is. But it's one of these plants that doesn't grow. Now, that sounds really weird. I think it's weird. It doesn't make sense to me. It makes sense to Michelle. It makes no sense to me. So this plant, what it does, when you put it in a new pot, it takes like between 1 and 3 years to get its roots situated before it will actually do anything. We've had this plant sitting on our windowsill since we've gotten married, and it's done nothing. I keep getting reassured that the plant is indeed doing what it's supposed to. All I see is nothing's happening to this plant. And I'm like, is it dead? Did I kill it accidentally? Probably, but that's beside the point. But apparently it's just what that plant does. That particular kind of plant, that I don't know what it is, but it just, I don't know what she said. It just sounded like it's S blah, blah, blah. Ask her if you're into plants and are really curious. But this plant, the way that it grows, it takes years for its roots to grow before you ever actually see the result of its growing. And it just so happens that after these several years, it's starting to have a couple little buds start to poke out, and it doesn't look like a stump anymore. It just took a lot of time for that plant to be ready to grow. And I think about that when it comes to faith. How for some people, they hear the word and they're going. The first time they ever hear about Jesus, they're like, oh, tell me more. Tell me everything I want to know. What do I have to read? I'm going to read the whole Bible, and they just do it. Their faith grows that fast. But other people, it takes a while. It takes years. It takes decades for people's faith to grow in a way that we can see it from the outside. Like that plant, stuff's still happening. It's just hard for us to see. And I think when we think about the parable of the sower, we have this image of, at least this is how I always thought it went, was God's the one that throws the seed out to everywhere and then it grows. But as I was reading it this time and I'm looking at kind of how this parable works, I'm going, well, no, there's nothing that says that God is the one who's actually sowing the word. A farmer is sowing the word. But God's the one that makes the word grow. And I think when we look at these parables all together, we see that we're the ones who sow the seed. We're the ones who go out and cast the word out into the world. And then, like a farmer, we wait. Sometimes that seed's going to land on a dirt path and nothing's going to happen. I mean, I can tell you, if a seed lands on asphalt, it's not going to do much. If it lands on the crack in the asphalt, just look at our parking lot, you could see that happen. But then sometimes you cast the seed out in the world and it lands on, well, it's shallow soil. It's soil, they spring up and they get real excited and then they're not anymore. We've all seen it happen. It might have probably happened to us before. We might have been that soil. Or we cast the seed out and it grows really good, but there's all kinds of other stuff growing with it. And the word doesn't get a chance to grow. But sometimes the word lands on good soil and it grows and it prospers and it multiplies. But you know what my favorite thing about this parable is? My absolute favorite thing about this parable. And it happened the day that I learned about tillers. I know that sounds really odd, right? For the day I learned that tillers exist is the day that this parable made sense. What does a tiller do? It churns up the dirt. If you've got a hard clump of dirt, you run a tiller over it and then you can use it. My favorite thing about this parable is that just because somebody's one type of soil one day doesn't mean they're always going to be that type of soil. It's my favorite thing about this parable. And so it encourages us to keep sowing the word, to keep casting the word out into the world. Because like the plant that sits on my windowsill, just because we don't see any growth in the people that we're casting the word to doesn't mean it isn't happening. Just because we can't see some result doesn't mean that God isn't still working in those people. And that's what I love about this parable. Really, the whole sets of parables, because it reminds us of all of these things. That the growth of faith isn't up to us. Growing faith in a person isn't up to us. God does that. God does all of the growing. We sow the word. And sure, you might throw in some fertilizer and churn up some dirt a little bit. But the actual growth, the actual thing that makes the seed of the word turn into faith is up to God. Just like the actual turning of the seed of a plant into a plant is also up to God. Sometimes that takes time, and it takes patience. But we just keep throwing out seed. And let God grow the faith. We sow the word, God makes it grow. And that's what these parables are all about. As confusing as they might be sometimes, as confusing as faith itself is sometimes, the faith that we have is meant to grow. And so God calls us to be his farmer, sowing the seed into the world and trusting him to make it grow.